Dad, you are still muted.
You're still muted, so I'm asking you to unmute, and I'm going to mute myself, and we've started recording.
Okay, I'm unmuted. Welcome, everybody. We're going to talk about the role of the military and other things in the liberation of Nazi camps. Whoops. What happened to my outline? Huh. I got a problem, Scott. Let's see. That's not the, well, that's strange. I had an outline slide. Let me see if I can figure out what's happening. Huh. Okay. It's not there anymore. One moment, we'll solve this technical problem. That's strange.
Dad, do you see where it says outline next to slides? When you look at the list, if you click there.
Yeah, see, the slide I had is gone for some reason. What I'm going to do is turn it off and reload it, and that should bring it back.
Okay.
If not, then we'll just go on without it. Okay, let me go back to PowerPoint. Sorry for the delay. We'll get this straight. Okay. Now we got to go back to screen sharing. Whoops. My screen sharing has disappeared.
Okay, when you put your cursor on the screen, you'll see the screen share button. It's in green on the bottom.
I'm not getting it. Oh gosh. There it is. Okay, got it. Okay, and now we'll go to the, there we go. Okay, and now we'll go to slideshow. And from current slide, there we go. Okay. So this is what we're going to talk about tonight. Should take about an hour to an hour and a half to go through the 52 slides. The first thing we'll do is talk a little bit about the timetable of the war, and show some slides about how quickly Germany expanded and collapsed in a very short period of time for both. We'll talk about evacuations and the death marches and how they were driven by the rapid advance of both Russia and the other allied forces. I have a slide or two on Elie Wiesel's journey, which was fascinating. Over, I think, about 500 miles, much of which he walked. We'll talk about the calendar of liberations and their impact. And then we'll get to the role of the US military, the various things they were responsible for. And then we'll focus in on 5 liberations that were the main ones that were done by the US Army. The Soviets actually did a lot more than the US. and other allies. Then I'll talk a little bit about the recognition ceremonies, the Day of Remembrance, and then summarize. And without further ado, here we go. In 1933, Hitler became the Chancellor of Germany. An interesting sidelight to that is that Albert Einstein in 1932 had taken a job at Princeton and was sharing his time between Berlin and Princeton. In January of 33, he was on his way back to Germany. The flight that he took had to land in Belgium to refuel. And somebody came running up to him and said that Hitler has just burned all your books and stole your beloved sailboat. So Einstein very adroitly got back on the plane, came back to Princeton, never went back to Germany, eventually renouncing his German citizenship. In April of that year, the activities against Jews began. They were dismissed from all professional positions and deprived of all citizens' rights. In 1936, Germany and Italy formed the Axis. And in November of that year, Germany and Japan signed a pact against Russia. And in 1938, I guess that's when you could say the war really began. Hitler annexed Austria. And of course, that year was the year of the terrible Kristallnacht. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland. And certainly then you could say the war began. And a couple of days later, France and Great Britain declared war on Germany. Between April and June of 1940, Germany invaded Denmark and Norway. Between May and June, Germany used quick strikes called blitzkriegs, a combination of armor, as you see in the slide, and infantry to take over much of Western Europe, the Netherlands, Belgium, northern France. In 1940, in May, Winston Churchill became leader of the British government. And as a side note there, it's interesting to point out that Churchill was very much against invading Europe by way of Normandy. Churchill, according to the references that I've read, felt that the Allied armies, and especially the US, which eventually, of course, entered the war, were ill-equipped, that US generals did not have enough battle experience. And so Churchill insisted that instead of going into Normandy right away, that the advance will be made through Italy. And he got his way. And that delayed the invasion of France for a year or two. And shortly after Churchill ascended to the leadership of the British government, Italy entered the war. In July of that year, 1940, Germany started air attacks on Great Britain. An interesting little story there. As a guided missile maintenance officer in the US Army, I was stationed at Redstone Arsenal. And this was between 1960 and 1963. Shortly before I was to be discharged, having served my obligation, I was informed that British officers were going to come to Redstone Arsenal to be trained on the US missile systems, Nike and Hawk. And at the northern gate of Redstone Arsenal, we had a V2. Now the V2 was the German missile that did tremendous damage to parts of Great Britain. So I went to the captain that I was working for and I said, sir, I think it's a good idea if we take the V2 down before the Brits arrive. And he just looked at me and said, why would we ever want to do that? So I left before they came and I don't know what the outcome was, but I'm sure it was not a very pleasant thing to greet them with. In September of 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan formed a pact, an alliance. And in 41, on June 22nd, Germany and Axis powers attacked Russia with over 4 million troops. And of course, December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked, and the next day, the US entered World War II. 42 in June, the Battle of Midway, and that pretty well defeated the Japanese Navy. And then the Italian approach began in July of that year. We took Sicily. By 43, Italy had surrendered. Germany helped Mussolini to escape to northern Italy and form a government there. And then, of course, June 6, 1944, almost 150,000 soldiers landed on Normandy on D-Day. And within 16 days, the Russian forces have reached central Poland. Well, by that time, the Russians had lost, according to the research that I did, some estimates put the losses at between 27 and 40 million. That includes civilian. The military losses, they estimate, were between 8 to 10 million. And the civilian loss is about 30 million. Now, from Moscow to Berlin is a distance of slightly over 1,100 miles, 1,127 miles. Yet the Russians got to Berlin just about the time we did, and it was only from the French coast to Berlin about 700 miles. And one of the reasons, I think, for that rapid Soviet movement was that the Soviets were really, really angry. They had lost so many people. Many of the people they lost, of course, were military in defending Leningrad and Stalingrad. But they also lost a lot of civilians, some to starvation, some to enemy action. And we're going to see a little bit later in this presentation the impact that that had on the Germans. By July 1st, about 3 weeks after D-Day, we had 850,000 Allied troops in Europe. It was a tremendous influx of troops into Europe. After the invasion, the first camp, Sobibor, was liberated by Russian troops on July 1st. By August 25th, Paris had been liberated. December 16th, the Germans had launched the Battle of the Bulge, which they lost to the Allies. In 1945, February, the invasion of Iwo Jima occurred. By March 22nd, the US Third Army under General Patton crossed the Rhine River. 1945, April 4th, the first camp liberated by US troops was called Ohrdruf. And I have a map here. I don't know if you can see it. See if I can get this out of the way. That's where it's located in Germany. So you can see it was pretty well in from the western border of Germany. So they had moved very quickly. Berlin, whoops, let me go back to that. Sorry about that. Berlin is located, I think, about here. You can see my cursor. On April 12th, Roosevelt passed away and succeeded by Truman. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide. And on May 7th, Germany surrendered. And of course, in August, the 2 atomic bombs on the 6th and 9th were dropped on Japan. And on September 2nd, Japan surrendered to MacArthur. This shows the movement of Soviet and US, UK, and French troops. Soviets coming, of course, from the east and the others from the west. So you can see that the Soviets went quite a bit further in a shorter period of time, really. And as you'll see from a future slide, many of the camps were in the east. So the Soviets really released a lot more of the liberated a lot more of the camps than the other Allied forces did. Here you can see the landing on Normandy. Bear in mind that north is to the right of the screen. So the British forces and the Canadian forces landed to the north. US forces, which were eventually joined by French forces, were in the south. On the day of the invasion, Rommel was not in Normandy. It turned out that the invasion had been delayed a couple of days because of weather, and June 6th happened to be his wife's birthday. Some accounts say he went to the south of France. Others say he went back to Germany. In any case, it's agreed that he was not at the scene of the battle. Now, only Rommel and Hitler could order the tanks, the German tanks, forward. And Hitler was sleeping, which I think he did a lot of the time. And so the aides did not want to awaken him. They couldn't find Rommel. And so the tanks never moved forward. If the tanks had moved forward, we would have lost many more Allied lives in the invasion. This is fascinating because it shows how quickly Germany expanded between March of 39 on the left and November of 42 in the center. So it took them about, what, 3.5 years to gain all that territory. And in less than 3 years, in about 2.5 years, the Allied troops had shrunk the areas under German control to what is shown in the panel on the right. They just barely had a piece of Germany, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Hungary, and a little bit of Yugoslavia. That was all that was left under their control. Now, because the Soviets and the Allies moved so quickly, the Germans decided that they had to evacuate concentration camps. And for 3 purposes. First of all, they didn't want prisoners falling into enemy hands alive to tell their stories. And they knew, at least on the Russian side, that there were many journalists accompanying the Russian troops. Secondly, many of the camps were used to produce armaments, and they needed the prisoners with the experience of producing those armaments wherever they could move them to, whatever camps were left and whatever facilities were left, to continue to produce the armaments they needed to prosecute the war. And finally, they had this idea, which nobody seems to, no historian seems to think would ever have worked, that they were going to use the Jewish prisoners as hostages to bargain for a separate peace. In the summer and early autumn months of 1944, most of the evacuations were carried out by train or by ship, if the German positions were cut off in the Baltic states primarily. As winter approached, and it was a miserable winter, and the Allies reached the German borders and German control areas shrank considerably, the prisoners were evacuated more and more on foot. And many of them did not have shoes, and many of them were lost to frostbite, to starvation, and to the German policy, which was if a prisoner couldn't keep moving, he was executed. In the summer of 44, with a massive Soviet offensive, they overran the camps at Lublin and Majdanek. Himmler shortly thereafter ordered forcible evacuations. And since there was no time left to completely empty Majdanek, the media, the Soviet media, could widely publicize atrocities at that camp. So then the world began to find out what the Germans were doing, at least through the media. By January 45, Germany was on the verge of military defeat. Most of German East Prussia was under Soviet occupation. They had besieged Warsaw, Poland, and Budapest, Hungary, and prepared to push German forces back toward the interior of the Reich. When the Ardennes offensive by the Germans failed in December of 44, the Anglo-American forces in the West were ready to invade Germany. And as I said, SS had orders to kill prisoners who couldn't walk or travel. As evacuations depended increasingly on forced marches and open rail cars in that brutal winter, the number who died of exhaustion and exposure along the routes increased dramatically. So here you can see some of the death marches, some of the death marches. For example, from Auschwitz, they took many of the prisoners to Dora Mittelbau. They took some of them first to Gross-Rosen and then to Buchenwald. Dora Mittelbau and Buchenwald were both administratively attached. So these were tremendous distances of 350 to 500 miles. And many of the prisoners had to walk a good part of that distance. So in 44, late 44 and 45, there were major evacuation operations from Auschwitz, Stutthof, Gross-Rosen, westward, moving back into Germany. Buchenwald, Flossenberg, Dachau, and Sachsenhausen. And then from Buchenwald and Flossenberg to Dachau. As Allied forces advanced into the heart of Germany, they liberated hundreds of thousands of concentration camp prisoners. And that included lots of prisoners that they found on the forced march evacuations. On April 25th, 1945, at a place called Torgau on the Elbe River in central Germany, right there, US forces and Soviet forces met. Germany, as I said before, considered unconditionally in the West on May 7th, in the East on May 9th. So May 8th was proclaimed Victory in Europe Day. As late as May 1st, 1945, prisoners who had been evacuated from Neuengaum and to the North Sea coastline were loaded onto ships, and hundreds of them died when the British bombed the ships a few days later, thinking that they carried German military personnel. So this map shows Elie Wiesel's 10-month Germany from the summer of 1944 to April of 1945. He started in Siget, which has a number 1 by it, went to Colomé, Budapest, Dachau, let's see, 5. Then in the area of Auschwitz and Krakow, 5, 6, 7, to Glowitz, and then to Buchenwald. So I've drawn a line to show his journey. The total distance that he traveled was over 500 miles. And along the way, he lost many family members. This is a calendar of major liberations, not all of them, but the major ones. So I've put the flags of the country that was liberating by the name of the camp. This is the Russian flag by Sobibor. This is French. Well, wait a minute. No, this is Polish, I guess. Russian. Then came the Americans in April of 45. By that time, Russia had liberated probably about a dozen camps, these being the major ones. Sobibor through Gross Rosen. Ohrdruf was the first one, Buchenwald. The British then liberated Bergen-Belsen. Okay. This is, I think, the Polish and Russian flags. Liberated Sachsenhausen, Flossenberg and Dachau by the Americans. And I think I already pointed that out, but today is the anniversary. 76 years ago today, Dachau was liberated. The 29th of April. Russia liberated Ravensbrück, Mauthausen, and Dora Mittelbau by US forces. And then Russia, Theresienstadt and Majdanek. You can see from this map that most of the camps were in the east. And you can look at the Russian flags to see where they were. The main camps in the west, Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Flossenberg, Dachau. And here's Mauthausen. So for a couple of reasons, Russia liberated more camps than the US forces and other allied forces, because most of the camps were in the east and Russia moved so quickly into across the German border. There's another map that shows where the camps were. Give you a minute to look at it. As I said before, once I get a copy of the video of this presentation, I can email it to anybody that wants it. So just send me an email if you'd like to get a copy of it. I'll be glad to send it to you. The liberators confronted unspeakable conditions in the camps. There were piles of corpses that lay unburied. Those that survived were skeletons, and lack of food, years of maltreatment, starvation, and disease. And because diseases were so prevalent, many of the camps had to be burned down to prevent the spread of epidemics. Survivors of the camps had a long and difficult road to recovery. I should acknowledge, by the way, that I got a lot of help from the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in preparing these slides. So what was the role of US military liberators? Well, first of all, they were passing out food and water. And in some cases, that was not the proper thing to do because the prisoners could not tolerate food and water in their emaciated state. They, of course, and many of them needed medical aid, and field hospitals had been set up, and they were taken there by US and other allied forces. They also wanted to gather evidence, and they had photographers, took many pictures of the camps. They had to detain the German guards, but in many cases, the Allied forces were so angry at what they had seen that they killed the German guards, or they gave the prisoners weapons, and the prisoners killed the German guards. In some cases, the German guards actually fought, and so there were battles at the camps. Of course, reunification where possible, and that was a very difficult thing to do. The Red Cross was helpful. And relocating liberated prisoners. And then, as I mentioned, the destruction of some camps to prevent the spread of disease. So now I'm going to pause here. We're going to go through some of the liberations. And before we do that, I'd like to give everybody a chance to ask any questions they may have at this point, and then we'll continue with the presentation. So you can unmute yourself if you have a question.
I just wanted to make a comment, and your presentation is amazing and very comprehensive. When I was looking at the map and showing where you had death camps and concentration camps, that the death camps were much to be seen on the Polish, in the Polish area, rather than closer to Germany itself. And I had taken a course on the period between the wars, and I was told that the Polish had already set up in their government to deal with the question of what to do with the Jews and how to get rid of the Jews. And if I've got it right, that the Germans really provided the Polish with an answer to that.
Yeah, and I put that map up again. Thank you, Rabbi Shudnow.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. I should point out that Rabbi Shudnow, the retired commander, Navy commander, and chaplain. Thank you for your service.
And thank you for your service as well.
Okay, anybody else have a question or a comment?
Yeah, if I might, this is Sheldon. One of the reasons the Russians were able to move so quickly was that after Stalingrad in the winter, people mistakenly believed that the Germans were mainly an armored force, and they were not. The Germans had, for an example, confiscated virtually all the automobiles and trucks and stuff like that from France to use as transport. And of course, when they broke down in the winter, there were no parts, there was no replacements. The Germans were primarily back to being nothing but a foot infantry group on foot and horse-drawn. And this is one of the reasons that the Russians were able to push them so fast back towards Germany.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, I think Leningrad was the first battle that the Russians tried to defend. And then it shifted to Stalingrad. Stalingrad was actually, let's see, I think I have a figure here, 1,645 miles from Berlin. So it was much further than Leningrad. Leningrad was just a little over 1,100 miles from Berlin. So the Germans had really penetrated pretty deeply. And in that bitter winter, with the breakdowns and the supply problems, they made the same mistake Napoleon made, I guess.
Question?
One comment on the swiftness of the Russians moving across they were helped by thousands and thousands of Studebaker trucks that the United States supplied them.
Huh.
They were able to move men, equipment, food, supplies, munitions on Studebaker trucks.
Huh.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
I read,
Can you identify yourself?
oh, Ann Gold.
Hi,
I
Ann.
read that when our side and the Russian side got near Berlin, there was a political decision to let the Russian troops go in first because they had suffered more than any of the other allies,
Yeah.
and that this would be an honor for them to be the ones. Have you any idea who made that decision?
Eisenhower.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Because Eisenhower knew how severe the Battle for Berlin was, and the Russians came in and suffered tremendous casualties, and Eisenhower wanted to prevent that. He annoyed a lot of the US soldiers because they wanted to go in, but he saved a lot of lives by letting the Russians go in.
Yeah, Eisenhower wasn't interested in fighting for a political capital. He wanted to kill the German soldiers. So that was one of the reasons that he agreed to let the Russians. Churchill wanted to go to Berlin, and so did Montgomery. If you notice where the forces were, the British forces were in the north, US forces were in the south.
Right.
And British forces had a shorter distance actually to go to get to Berlin. But Eisenhower didn't want to sacrifice troops for a political capital.
Right.
Interesting. Yeah.
Question?
Any other questions or comments?
Yes, question. iPad. Were the liberation of the camps a deliberate strategic ploy by the Russians or the Americans, or were they just on the way towards Berlin?
From what I've been able to read, they just came across them when, as they moved, in the case of the US troops, as they moved eastward, they came upon these camps. In fact, and I think this is mentioned in another slide a little bit further on, there were no orders given, no general orders given to the US troops as to what to do when they came across a camp. They just had to improvise. So I think it was not a strategic move. It was simply that they were walking eastward or riding eastward, and they came across these camps. Sheldon, is that your impression?
Yeah, absolutely. You're absolutely right. Ordruff, for an example, was one of those examples. And there were other cases where even German citizens told them where the camps were as they were walking by. And so they would detour a little bit to get there. In one case I read, they found the camp by the smell. And they actually followed the odor and found the camp that way.
Wow. Yeah, I want to repeat these figures about the Soviet losses in case some of you didn't hear it the first time. The estimates are that in the battles that occurred in the Soviet Union, primarily Leningrad, Stalingrad, and the movement of German troops through the Soviet countryside, it's estimated that between 27 and 40 million Russians died. And of that number, 8 to 10 million were military. So there were a lot of civilian losses. The Allied losses for the US, the UK, and France in the war, estimated at 1.5 million. So you can see that the Russians had suffered terribly even before they got anywhere near Berlin.
I'd like to, if I might, I'd just like to point out a personal experience as the assistant fleet chaplain of the Commander 6th Fleet out of Italy, riding ships throughout the Mediterranean. I was privileged to be able about twice each year to go into Germany, where there was a retreat, a Jewish retreat center in Bavaria that was given over to the US military and to the Jews. And we would have retreats there. At one of the retreats, Rabbi Herschel Schachter, Alav HaShalom, who was the army chaplain with the troops that liberated Buchenwald. And I became, over the years, close with Herschel Schachter, and I have a picture together, and we're holding hands as the picture is being taken. Maybe I'll be able to show that to you, Alan Breitler, since we're close neighbors, or I could show it in another way. But it's very, very powerful, and of course the story of Meir Lau, the chief rabbi of Israel, and how he got that special feeling of his Judaism with the liberation by Rabbi Schachter.
Yeah, thank you, Rabbi Schachter.
A couple of points that, if I can.
Sure, sure.
Number one, fortunately for the Battle of Normandy, Hitler took a sleeping pill. So you're correct. They were afraid to wake him up, but fortunately he had taken a sleeping pill, which had him sleep much longer, and worked out very good for the Allies. Eisenhower was given credit, deservedly, that he wanted all these, all documentation, and even made German citizens in nearby villages march through the death camps to see what went on. And Eisenhower said that we need to document this because as time goes on, nobody will believe this ever happened.
Yeah, I have a slide to that effect, yeah.
Okay, and then two other little quick things. A fact that maybe is not well known, and you mentioned that we entered World War II. We never declared war on Germany.
Huh.
It's an interesting little fact. And I'm a pharmacist, and when I was a student back in the late 50s and 60s, I worked with Sidney Weinberg, who I believe was a colonel in the US Army. And he didn't talk very much, but we got on the topic one day, and he mentioned what was said before, that they were going down this road and it was curving. There was a slight hill on the side, but the odor was horrible. And as they came around, I can't remember which camp it was, but that's how they found the camp, by the odor.
Thank you.
Dad,
Okay.
could I add something?
Sure.
Because of the bitterness that the Russians felt, when they finally got within the borders of Germany, they were utterly rapacious.
Yeah.
To the point where not only were they doing mass rapes, but they were actually crucifying civilians. And one of the consequences of that was that the word got out to the remainders of the German army that surrender to the Russians was futile. And so that meant that they were going to fight every single inch of the way. That probably prolonged the war by an additional month.
Yeah.
Because there was no surrender, because there was no point in surrendering.
Did that prompt some Germans to try to surrender to the US?
Oh, absolutely,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah,
There was a mad rush to the west.
yeah, yeah. Thank you, Rabbi Wolkos.
Dad, I was also curious if you could put the slide back up with the 3 maps of a little bit of a timeline map of the expansion and contraction of German-controlled areas.
That one?
Yeah, that's it. So I was curious about the timing when Norway shows up as under control and when it does not. I don't know enough about it, but having lived in the disgustingly self-protected Sweden, you know, I had a little bit more. I had some focus on Norway, but I don't remember the whole story. Do you have that?
No, I'm sorry, I don't. I'll have to look that up.
Okay.
I can add something to that. They invaded Norway as a protection. They were afraid that the Allies would take the northern route, and what they did was they occupied it. And the Allies so much information that they were going to invade Norway that Germany kept, I don't know, 500,000 troops in Norway till the end of the war. And he didn't do anything. He just kept them there. And they were occupied, and they were just told at the end of the war, give up.
There's also a story about the attempt or the activity, the operation, I should say, of Allied troops. I think the British were involved to capture or to protect the heavy water facilities in Norway, because heavy water was needed for the development of the atomic bomb. And they were afraid Germany was on the verge of it, and they were. So there's I think there's a movie on that. I'll try to get.
Yes, Kirk Douglas.
Yes.
In that movie, the Germans had Tromsø, where the heavy water plant was.
Yeah.
And the Norwegians fought to blow it up.
Right.
The British invaded it. They had commandos.
Yeah.
And then what they did was the Germans wanted to get the stash of heavy water out, put it in containers onto a ferry boat, and the Allies put a time bomb on that ferry boat and sunk it in the middle of whatever the sea was at the deepest part. So that was the end of that. And they knew that there were Norwegian citizens on that ship, and they were killed also.
Okay.
Could I say just one additional thing? Since we started out with mentioning Japan, of course, and their part in the war. I was stationed in Japan for 3 years, covering Army, Air Force, and Navy throughout mainland Japan. And I do want to point out that the Japanese were so incredibly, in my time, grateful to the Americans. And we had so many American bases, but because of the Marshall Plan and the goodness of America and what we did for Japan, they could not believe that a force such as the United States that was at war with them could be so giving and so kind. And so I was treated with incredible respect by the Japanese. I just would
What years were that?
So that was in 1979 to 1982.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Shednow. All right, I'm going to move along now, and we'll talk about the first camp that the US forces liberated. It's the 4th Armored Division, which landed in Normandy July 13th. That would be about a week after D-Day. And they were called the Breakthrough Division. They provided support during the Battle of the Bulge, and by war's end, they had reached the Czech border. They overran Ohrdruf, which was a subcamp of Buchenwald, on April 4th, 1945, and liberated that camp. It was the first camp liberated by US troops. Now, Ohrdruf was supplying forced labor for railway construction leading to a proposed communications center. But because of the rapid US advance, that center was never completed. In late March of 1945, there were some 11,700 prisoners there. But in early April, they were all evacuated on death marches to Buchenwald, which was somewhat to the south, but nearby. Here's a picture from the Holocaust Memorial Museum of US troops entering Buchenwald. April 4th, 1945. Buchenwald was liberated on April 11th, Ohrdruf on April 4th, and Buchenwald April 11th. And on the day of liberation, an underground prisoner resistance seized control to prevent atrocities. The American forces at Buchenwald liberated more than 20,000 prisoners. This is a statement that was referred to, I think, by Sheldon, of Eisenhower at Ohrdruf. The things I saw beggared description, the visual evidence, the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things, if ever in the future there develops a tendency to charge these allegations merely to propaganda. That's Eisenhower. He wrote that in a letter to General Marshall on April 15, 1945. Then comes Dora Mittelbau, also known as Dora Nordhausen, or Nordhausen, which is the nearest city. And you can see from the map where it was located. So it's already in central Germany. It was originally a subcamp of Buchenwald, and the Dora Mittelbau eventually became independent and had more than 30 subcamps of its own under its administrative control. To give you an idea of the size of the facility, it's huge. And the area outlined in red was where the prisoners were kept. People from the nearby village, Germans, were enlisted to bury the dead. So the people on the right, standing on the right, on the roadway, are Germans from the nearby villages. And you can see the bodies in the ditch that they were burying. This gives you an idea of the scale of the inside of the crematorium. at Dora Mittelbau. It's huge. Originally, most of the people working there were Slavs, and they were treated very brutally and inhumanely. They had to work 14-hour days. They had no basic hygiene, beds, rations, and around 1/3 of the roughly 60,000 prisoners who were sent there died. Today, there's a memorial and museum there. In early April of 45, they began to evacuate Dora Mittelbau, taking them mostly to Bergen-Belsen. The 3rd Army Armored Division landed on the Normandy beaches in late June, weeks after D-Day, and advanced rapidly eastward and reached the German border by mid-September. They captured Cologne, which I've put on a star on this map, in March of 45. In April, near the town of Göttingen, which I'll remark about in a moment, they captured another location there. And you can draw a line from Cologne through Thuringia, and you see where they were headed. The reason I want to mention Göttingen is that for centuries, and even today, it is the site of one of the most advanced scientific universities and research centers, having at one time hosted Einstein, Planck, and many other famous scientists from many different countries. They discovered Dora Mittelbau and requested help from the 104th Infantry Division. Tanks always move with infantry. So the 3rd Armored and the 104th Infantry were moving together. They began transporting ill and starving prisoners to nearby hospital facilities. The 104th landed in France in September of 44. They were called the Timberwolf Division. This is their symbol. And liberated Dora Mittelbau on April 11th, 1945. They found 3,000 corpses lying around the camp. Some 750 starving and ill prisoners who had been left behind after the evacuation. And this camp, interestingly enough, was working, producing the V-2 rockets that caused such havoc in Great Britain. Okay, then we come to Dachau. Let me move the this over so you can see the slide. So we come to April 29th, 1945. This was the first concentration camp, 5 weeks, established 5 weeks, only 5 weeks after Hitler took power. During the first year, they had about 5,000 political prisoners. Whoops, sorry. I don't know what happened. Hold on just a minute. There we go. So it was political prisoners first, and then by 38, Jews began to comprise a major portion of the prisoners at Dachau. They were used for armaments production. It was a training center for SS guards and served as a model for other camps. Prisoners were used as guinea pigs in medical experiments and killed hundreds of prisoners as a result of experiments. Thousands of inmates died or were executed. Thousands more were transferred to Austria when they became too sick or weak to work. In 1944, to increase war production, the main camp was supplemented by dozens of satellite camps. And these camps were administered by and collectively called Dachau. The Germans used Dachau as a destination from other camps, but then on April 27, near the end of the war, they took 7,000 prisoners, mostly Jews, and began a death march 40 miles to the south. And the next day, many of the SS guards abandoned the camp. April 29th, the camp was liberated by the 45th Infantry, the US Infantry Division. They found more than 30 railroad cars filled with bodies. And there were about 30,000 survivors, mostly severely emaciated. Some of the American troops were so angry by what they saw that they started to kill guards. They think the 30 SS guards were killed, but conspiracy theorists have alleged more than 10 times that number were executed. The German citizens of Dachau were later forced to bury 9,000 dead inmates found at the camp. This mostly repeats what I've said in other slides. Records indicate that at least 32,000 of the 90,000 inmates that passed through Dachau perished there. I'm sorry, 160,000. Well, this just tells a little bit about the 14th Armored Division. Here on the right is a picture of a train at Dachau with dead prisoners. And there are the prisoners at the electric fence at Dachau cheering American soldiers when they came through. Some of them you can see are wearing the striped prison garb. They decorated their huts with flags of all the nations, which they had made secretly as they heard the guns of the 42nd Rainbow Division, one of Patton's 3rd Army divisions, getting louder and louder on the approach to Dachau. You can see some flags flying here from one of the buildings. Okay, somebody was saying they were at Dachau, if they'd like to make some comments.
Yeah, that's me, Steve Breitkoff. Back in the 90s, I was working on a project where we were dealing with a German company based in Munich, but had a factory up by Hamburg. So first we went to Munich, and we had a day to kind of kill, just because it was an overnight flight, and Dachau was right near Munich. So we had a car, we rented it, and we drove to the concentration camp, Dachau. We drove through the town of Dachau. It's a beautiful town. And the concentration camp is right next to the town. But what really impressed me was the visitor center, where they had movies of what went on at Dachau in every language of the prisoners that were at Dachau. And they showed the motion pictures of the experiments, and they were trying to do experiments on in hyperbaric chambers to see at what altitude the pilots would black out. They also had a poster with all the divisions of the different prisoners, whether you were gay and Jewish, or gay and Russian, or you were a Frenchman, or whatever it was. They had everything so compartmentalized. It was amazing. But the one thing that impressed me the most was the fact that they didn't try to hide anything. And while we were there, there was a high school class that was going through there, taking this all in. So that was Dachau. What they did was they surrounded the camp is still there. All the barracks were destroyed, but they rebuilt two of the barracks just to show you how the barracks were set up. And there were gas chambers there. They left those. There were a lot of memorials there. It was very unnerving. But what unnerved me even more was when we went up to Bergen-Belsen, up near Hamburg. We were there in the wintertime. Now, we're right near the North Sea. It is cold up there. It is damp up there. It's freezing. The winds are howling. And we were all in our winter gear. We couldn't stay outside for more than 15 minutes. The camp was liberated by the British, who burned it down because typhus was in the camp and was raging in the camp. So they only have a small visitor center there, nothing much. But what really gets you to show the enormity of the crimes that the Nazis did, you go outside and you see mounds of earth, 3 feet, 4 feet high, 20 feet wide, 20 feet deep, for as far as the eye can see. And on each mound of earth, there is a flag that says, here lie 5,000 dead. Here lie 8,000 dead. Here lie 20,000 dead, for as far as you can see. So it shows you the enormity. That really got to me. It really got to me.
I had
That was my experience.
Excuse me, I had also visited Dachau, and it was so well preserved, and you could experience, you could go through, and you knew exactly where you were and what was had happened there. And I took a special photograph, which I made into an artwork of the electrified fence. And the JWV actually took that and they used it as one of the images for that year calendar. I had visited Mauthausen in Austria, and that was a labor camp. And I have to tell you that the day that we as Jewish chaplains from our military, the US military. We stood out there and it was so beautiful. The day, the scenery at Mauthausen, just on the outside, and you could just imagine the terrible experience that people suffered so much in such a magnificently beautiful surroundings outside. Unbelievable.
Thank you very much, yeah. Okay, Mauthausen is what you were talking about.
One thing, Mr. Breitler,
Yes,
my father was a prisoner at Dachau. He survived Dachau and he survived the death march. And he described that they marched and they went to sleep, and in the morning, the German soldiers were gone. And still they were in the middle of nowhere, and many of them died before they got to anywhere.
yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your comments. Mauthausen was liberated May 5th. One of the quotes by a man named Alec Ward is shown here. He got a tin of peas from an American soldier, and he said he drank the liquid that he was given first, and he couldn't take the liquid, and he gave the peas to a friend. Between 38 and 45, more than 190,000 people were imprisoned at Mauthausen. At least 90,000 people were murdered there. And Flossenberg was liberated by the 1st Infantry Division. It was called the Big Red One. May 8th, 1945, they liberated Flossenberg. It didn't have many prisoners when they liberated it. Many of them had been evacuated. Here's a picture of Flossenberg. So you can see it's pretty extensive facility. In February of '85, 2 Holocaust survivors, Sigmund Strachlitz and Benjamin Mead, formally requested permission to display in the future museum the flags of all the US units that participated in liberation of Nazi camps. And so on the Days of Remembrance ceremony, which is held annually in the US Capitol Rotunda, these flags are displayed, and you can see them in the picture in the background on the right. All of the unit flags. The 42nd, the 80th, and the 90th Infantry Divisions were part of Patton's Third Army. There's another picture showing Days of Remembrance and the recognition. 36 US Army divisions have been recognized thus far for the liberation efforts. In summary then, Churchill delayed the Normandy invasion and subsequent camp liberation, believing that the US was incapable of pulling it off, and forced the Allies to come through Italy, Sicily and Italy before Normandy. Soviet troops liberated about twice as many camps as US forces. Camp prisoners often died of malnutrition, typhus, and other diseases, or guard brutality, especially on the death marches. And it was the speed of Soviet and US progress that prompted, to a great extent, the German death marches. There were no general orders issued concerning procedures to be used in liberating camps. But there were orders that as many soldiers as possible should view the camps. Liberating units, soldiers often gave former prisoners food and drink, and that often caused health problems. They also often killed German guards, either because of resistance or out of anger. And 36 division level US units have been recognized as liberating units out of 61 divisions in the European theater of operations that was headed by Eisenhower. I hope that this serves as a remembrance of the horrors that everybody went through at these camps. And I hope that you've learned a little bit more about what happened during that terrible time. Thank you for participating.
Thank you so much for your wonderful presentation.
Well, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Speechless, Dad. Great job.
You taken any comments, Alan?
Yes, go ahead.
I had a study group with a bunch of gentlemen who fought with the troops that went across. One of my friends was used when they came to Dachau to speak to the prisoners, since he was conversant in Yiddish and they didn't speak much English. My other friend went across and they freed another camp where he was captured by a young DP lady who he was able to marry and bring back to the States. So there was a lot going on. My wife and I, in our travels through Europe, we didn't go through Dachau, but we went through Theresienstadt, which was made into a beautiful park, and we went to Mauthausen.
Thank you for the presentation. This is Arthur Fligelman. My father-in-law, Samuel Warren, was part of the 4th Armored Division and actually was part of the group that liberated the first concentration camp from the US side. And he unfortunately has passed away, but he made a video of his recollections. If you're interested in seeing that, possibly, you might find that informative because he was actually part of the group.
Can you email it to me?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure how to reach you. I sent an email to Rabbi Wolkoff, and he sends me your email. We can figure out how to get you a copy of it.
Yeah, Rabbi Wolkoff knows how to get in touch with me.
I have no doubt he does.
I know where you live.
Where is that, by the way?
I'm sorry?
Where do you live, by the way?
I live in Silver Spring. Rabbi
Yeah,
Wolkoff's in New Jersey.
You know, I know where Rabbi Wolkoff lives, but yeah, I'll be happy to Rabbi Wolkoff contact me and send it to you.
Yeah.
Alan lives near a beautiful synagogue called the Mormon Temple.
We have one of them here too.
Thank you all very much.
Do please make the video and the PowerPoint presentation available to those of us that are on the call. Rabbi Wolkoff, you should have all of our email addresses.
Sure.
And do make them available. This was a very great, really excellent summary of the war, and it would be useful for all of us, but in particular for me to have it.
Yeah, I'll make sure to distribute that widely.
Right. Any of my people who want a copy of it, send me an email, so I'll send it and make sure that you get it.
Do you still count me as one of your people?
Absolutely, always. You can't get away, darling.
So long as you're a foodie, you'll be one of our people.
Absolutely.
You can use your own internal clock for that, Gail.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dad.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right,
Bye-bye.
Rabbi Wolkoff. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
The rabbi with 5 children. One is a dog and one is a cat.
Bye.
Love you, Dad.
Bye. Love you.
Love you. Yashar kochacha.